Zach, the dynasty season, the regular season is fast approaching. We got to talk about some rules that we have of engagement with our league, with our strategies. How do we handle our rosters during the season to keep us on top? And maybe we don't win the league, but we still dominate our league one way or another with these strategies. Zach, I want to kick it to you first. What do you got with your first talking point here?
Identify players that I'm going to try to trade for at later points in the season, right? We wish we had the roster of everybody we wanted, right? But we do a startup draft, there's just going to be players you miss. Same with a rookie draft. There's going to be players you're just not able to target. Identify some of those players that you want to target. Is it a veteran player that may not be available to you currently? Were you not able to get a specific rookie in the rookie draft? There are points in the regular season, Bob, when your league mates' strategies and needs may change and alter. Did they incur a significant injury that now has them not trying to win this year? They're trying to shed points off their roster. This may be a buying opportunity for you. Is this rookie that you want not performing at all right now? A great example a couple years ago is Amon-Ra St. Brown. The first 10 weeks was just non-existent, and there was plenty of buying opportunities for Amon-Ra St. Brown. Could you buy that player from an owner who is upset that they're not getting anything from that player? Continue to check in with your league mates every few weeks and try and target those players. And this idea, Bob, also it bleeds into the offseason because, again, teams' needs and focuses may change and shift, and that player may no longer fit their strategy or their game plan in that league. So just because you don't have the players you want now or after your startup draft or after your rookie draft does not mean that you cannot get them later. Just stay locked in, stay in touch. You know, if you're playing on Sleeper, there's a feature nobody uses this. I do. Go and heart that player every week. Bink, bink. Let them know you're interested, man, because in the offseason, people get bored, you know? So just continue to try to target the players that you want to get throughout the entire season, Bob.
Yeah, I think you make a great point of just kind of paying attention. Hey, you know you want this guy. Might not have been able to get him before the season. That's okay. Keep him on your watch list, whatever the case is. And then another great point you added on top of it was making note of when a significant change happens in that roster. Maybe they're starting off their season really hot and they don't need a rookie anymore that isn't really putting up points yet. Maybe they want a Mike Evans instead of a Michael Wilson, and you can move Mike Evans for Michael Wilson plus a second round pick or something to that effect. I think it's a great point. Or if it's an injury, last year, plenty of people had Javonte Williams and Breece Hall go down, and those were competitive teams that were expecting to be solid last year. That wasn't the case. Those teams could have gone into an immediate rebuild where they're looking to move off of players. Maybe now you want to get in on some competitive assets. Keep these things in mind, and very quickly you could change the course of your team just by being Johnny on the spot, paying attention, and being able to meet a team's new need or a need they didn't even know they had. Speaking of moving on, my number one point, and one that I just think that whatever you're doing, whenever you're in a dynasty league, know your team's identity. Know where you're going, know if you're rebuilding, knowing if you're contending, know if you're stuck in the middle. But understanding where you're at is crucial for your team's development, your roster's development, and the moves you make in your league. Without this simple principle, you're just out there. You're just making moves for the sake of making moves. And I love making trades more than anybody. But if you're just making trades for the sake of making trades, you're going to end up getting nowhere, and you're going to end up stuck in the middle. Know if you're a team full of younger players that just isn't ready to compete yet. We all have every year, Dynasty Rankings are just plastered with the young hotness as opposed to players that are actually going to score you points necessarily. It's just fact of the matter is. And unfortunately, if you just have all those top 10 young hot players, there are some that are going to score you points. If you have a lot of Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chases, okay, fine. This point is a little moot, but that's unlikely. But as we've touched on in the past, sexy paper rosters don't win championships. It's a mix of aging vets, productive youth, and all of the things and smart moves that end up winning championships. But know your identity, know where you're at, know if you need another year to build, know if you need to rebuild, especially, so you don't end up just sitting on a roster that's dying for any longer than you need to.
This is such an important thing here, Bob. And we're all football junkies here, right? We've all seen the movie Draft Day where Kevin Costner has that player's name written like draft this guy no matter what. That should be you. with that rule. This is my rule for the entire year because people are going to
Sure.
offer you trades that do not make sense for that rule.
Mhm.
And they're going to try and justify it. Oh, I thought this. It's like, I always engage a trade offer. Why did you send me this? This doesn't make any sense for me. Are you some kind of moron? Like, no, I don't say that. But I engage, like, listen, I have a specific strategy. I'm only targeting young players or picks, or I'm trying to win. I don't want young players right now. I'm preferring veterans to whatever, XYZ. Have that rule always there, right here, for every single thing you do, every move you make, every trade you offer, every trade that you look at, every decision you make should follow that rule, Bob.
Zach, you touched on a great point, and oddly enough, it leads right into my next one. Stick to moves that fit the identity of your team's trajectory.
Yep.
You pick the direction, stick with it. If you start making all these moves, you go back to the previous statement of you're just going to end up in the middle of nowhere. Simply put, don't make moves that don't make sense for your team build. If you're a young rebuilding team, it doesn't make sense to invest in productive, aging assets that won't outlast the rebuild that you're in. And similarly, for competitive teams, it doesn't make sense to overinvest in rookies or young developmental players or draft capital. The more moves you make that fit one direction, the closer you'll be to your desired destination, which is ultimately a championship someday. But sometimes to get there, you need to really commit to a rebuild before you can go, oh, well, I rebuilt for half a season. Now I can definitely turn it on. When has that really worked? I can think of one occasion for myself, but very rarely is a rebuild going to take less than 2 years to really break things down and do things right. Unless you're able to just make perfect moves, everybody pans out. It's just not a likely scenario. Just fact of the matter is, unfortunately. But make the moves that fit the direction you're headed, as opposed to, you, like you said, people are going to make offers that don't fit. People are going to offer you Mike Evans. I hate to bring him up constantly, but people are going to offer you Mike Evans for a decent value, and it's going to be hard to say no sometimes to these good value deals. And it's like, well, hey, I don't hate the player. It just doesn't work for me. And that's okay to say. It's okay to acknowledge that. I think you're better for it if you're able to. But keep these things in mind that when you're navigating trades, whether you're making offers or accepting offers, possibly, don't make moves that don't make sense for the team build you're on. I think it's also very risky to try to, maybe if you can get Mike Evans for a third round pick, there's obviously the argument of, well, I could probably flip him for a second later. Possible, but it's also possible he could break his leg next week and you get nothing
Yep.
for him.
Yes, sir.
It's just a unfortunate, fickle game to play. Hate having to do it, but it's just one of those things. I think it's better to stick to the trajectory you're on. Don't make moves outside of that until you start getting to that next level of development in your team towards building towards making a competitive turn. And that's just not going to happen year one of a rebuild. With all that said, Zach, diving on to your next point, this is a good one. This is something that always happens. People will face this 100% of every season, all the time. They will face something along this line. Zach, what do you got?
Yeah, for me, this is something I do a lot of, and for good reason. We've discovered through my time here at Dynasty Rewind that I'm not a big risk taker. But if I can buy a player at a lower price than what I will normally be able to, I will take that risk. I will buy players injury dips. Don't be afraid to buy them. Injuries offer great opportunities, Bob, to buy players, usually for the next season, at somewhat of a discount. And that could be at the genesis of the injury. It could be in the offseason. A lot of times you see the injury dips lowest value in the offseason. Like Cooper Kupp was probably going for less than what you could have bought Cooper Kupp for at the time of the injury, because there's just this matriculation of, oh man, he's 30 years old, this, that, blah, blah, blah. Everybody finding a reason to devalue Cooper Kupp. So again, the value keeps dipping lower and lower because of the dialogue around that player. So for me, I'm buying injury dips, Bob. You do have to be smart and careful about this. Like, I don't really go all out. I don't oftentimes offer like my only first round pick for an injury dip. But Javonte Williams was a great one. I think if you bought Javonte Williams 6-8 months ago, right now it's looking decent. Like, you might not get that immediate return to where he was value wise before, but his value right now is definitely higher than it was 6 or 8 months ago because
Yeah.
he's not on the pup to start the season, which is great
Yeah.
news. So don't be afraid to buy injury dips because to me, those are sometimes opportunities, the only opportunities to buy players at a much lower cost than what they should normally cost. A great one again, Brees Hall. I have a lot of Brees Hall shares after not buying him in the rookie draft because, not only the Dalvin Cook news, but the ACL tear. There's a lot of worries there. People don't want to wait for that. It's probably going to take another full year of recovery. I'll buy Brees Hall and I'll take those extra 3 years of production at a lower cost of what I could have bought prior to the injury, Bob.
Yeah, I think the huge thing with buying into injuries, because I'm not super opposed to it, but I think it comes down to value first. First and foremost, comes down to value. You need to be getting a discount, and it needs to be a pretty good one. I don't want to pay the value I was paying before the injury. I want to get a good discount. That's half the reason for buying. And then I think the one thing to keep in mind is the expectation you put on the player once you get them on your roster. If you are I'm still in the camp. I don't believe in Javante or Brees Hall this year, and I didn't believe in Brees Hall even before the Dalvin Cook news. I'm well on the record saying that I have people waiting with pitchforks outside my house for when they both do really well this season. The ACL seem to be not an issue anymore. But the fact of the matter is, you need to have an expectation. If you're setting up with those two to be productive next year and you made those purchases whenever you did to get them lower, I'm fine with that. My concern is if you're trying to put them to be solid sooner rather than later. And I think that's the one thing is like injury optimism gets you into trouble. I don't think you should be ultra pessimistic about injuries either, but I think some realism is what's needed for most injuries. And just, hey, there's plenty of history saying that Javonte Williams and Brees Hall are not going to be very reliable this year. And that's just fair to say. Fact of the matter is, we have a lot of history pointing towards that direction, but that they can both be very viable running backs beyond this season. That's also on the record. And I've said that I'm fine with that. I'm fine with the expectation for the future, or just understanding that they're probably not going to be at full capacity, even. Like, not saying that they're not going to be good. I don't think they're bad players. But either which way, like you said, the value, you have to be smart and careful with it 100%. And I think that boils down to getting the right price, all about the value that's needed, and then having the right expectation for what they're going to do on your roster. Because if you put too much faith in these guys being what they were before the injury, that's where I think you get into trouble. And I'm not disagreeing with this point. That's just my preface or my additional 2 cents. And you're talking about injuries, which oddly enough leads me into my next point about not overreacting to injuries or cold spells. Injuries are going to happen. We know they will. So will cold spells. There are going to be times where players just aren't playing well for a course of several games. And you have to look at, are they dealing with an injury? Oddly enough, also coinciding in this point. Are they dealing with an injury that's, just kind of lagging around? Are they dealing with really tough defenses? Are they dealing with a tough corner that they have to face if they're a wide receiver? Is their offensive line banged up if they're a running back? Or are they facing a really good linebacker core, a really good run defense? What is the cause of this cold spell? And then also, as I'll touch on later, is this a point where you're trying to buy the dip on a player who could be in a cold spell on another team or injured on another team, and people are willing to dip on a guy because he's just not performing, even though it seems clearly on paper that this guy is just fine? It's just a couple of bad matchups. I did this a few years ago with Aaron Jones. Started off the season real bad, had 3 really tough matchups, and the guy was just, I need to get out on him. And I don't remember the deal at this point. I'd have to go way back to figure it out. But I acquired Aaron Jones, and he ended up being, I think that was his best running back finish year. And it was just because I looked ahead, looked at the schedule, and was like, hey, his next rest of the season is really cherry. He's just going through the 4 worst weeks of his season. Bought him the very next week, rode him through the rest of the season, won the championship that year. It was a great year. It was a great time. Had a blast doing it. But keeping these things in mind and not being the guy who sells on players who are just having a couple bad games. Good players just have bad games. Not every game from Justin Jefferson is going to be 150 yards and 2 touchdowns. It's just not going to happen. Same thing with not overreacting to injuries. And I think one of the worst things you do with an injury is selling the injured player, because you're, like you just touched on, Zach, you're usually selling them at a discount. usually need to do something adjacent to that player to make a real impact. But I don't want to, overreact to an injury. I don't want to say, Cooper Kupp's dead because he hurt his ankle last year, or hurt his leg last year. He's a dead player. Everything seems to be okay at this point. I don't want to be somebody who just gets an injury, the guy's dead to me. I want to be the guy on the other side of that, like you said, with, if a guy's going to miss a couple weeks, can I get in on this? Can I be a guy who buys in on the value as opposed to just dipping on a guy? Or, hey, if you're having that concern in your league, if you're concerned about Jerry Jeudy in one league, you have Jerry Jeudy. You were feeling really good about him this season, but now he has this hamstring issue and you're concerned. You need to think about that and think, well, how is this situation going to play out for Jerry Jeudy? Is he going to be back at some point? This, everybody was worried he was going to fall off the face of the earth. It was a season-ending injury. But now you have to think of it as, well, it seems like he's going to be back in a handful of weeks. Seems like he's going to be fine. If you're feeling this way and somewhat panicking about a player, can you go buy? Are you willing to go try to buy low elsewhere? Use situations to your advantage. Don't just overreact to, and I'm not saying do that with Jerry Jeudy. I'm just as an example. But when you see these situations arise, don't just overreact and run the other way. Look at the situation, melt it down for what it is. Is it one of these factors where, hey, he's going to be injured, but he's going to be back in 2 weeks and he's going to be just fine? And keep in mind that injuries usually lag on a couple weeks after the injury happens and after the player's back. Either way, just don't overreact. Don't panic sell. Don't panic buy. Don't get yourself in these terrible situations. That's why depth is so crucial heading into seasons, and why we don't necessarily want to, when we do these roster reviews, one of the big things we look at is depth. And especially if you're a competitive team, because we know injuries are going to happen. And the last thing we want is to be caught in a stranglehold of having to find depth for our team. So just don't overreact to these things. Find ways to, make good on other people's situations. Like you mentioned earlier too, if there's injuries on other teams, be the guy going to fix that situation to benefit yourself, maybe in a rebuild. Or if that team's switching gears to a rebuild themselves, maybe you can make a competitive move for yourself. Zach, feel free to touch on this move, or this concept, I should say, this rule, not overreacting to injury or cold spells. I talked on for a long time there. Need to get a drink. Zach, speak on your thoughts if you have any. Otherwise, dive into your next point.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, Bob, because we are speaking to an audience of a good amount of newer dynasty players that are coming over from redraft. And in redraft, when you have that situation happen, you're not thinking about a year from now.
Yeah.
So
right. True.
In redraft, you're trying to capitalize on a potential sell, as opposed to in dynasty, does this player have worth to me in a year from now? So very good point. And speaking to some of our dynasty people that have been playing dynasty for a long time, it's like you said, it's much easier to say right now, oh yeah, of course. But when you're going through that cold spell, when Aaron Jones is getting outproduced by AJ Dillon, it's tough to stick with Aaron Jones. Like, it's tough. And that Bob kind of bleeds into my next point, which is do your homework on players. Mm-hmm. Do your homework on game day situations. And this really applies in the wintertime. We'll get into that in just a second. But this is just a general point of do your homework, man. Like, look at your team. How do your bye weeks align? I've talked about this before. Like, do you have 6 players out for week 13? You need to start looking at the waiver wire on week 10 and week 11. Who are players that you could start in week 13? Do your homework on matchups. This team allows running backs to catch 5 passes a game 90% of the time. It's probably better to start Aaron Jones in this game than to sit him because A.J. Dillon has been outscoring him. But specifically, money time for dynasty leagues is the last month of the regular season, right? You're talking about weeks 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. 13 and 14 are the last 2 weeks of your regular season. By the way, week 13 is a terrible week for buys. But weeks 15, 16, 17, that is December. There are a lot of situations where weather is affecting games, and you have to be on top of these situations. And I remember one specific situation for me last year, Bob. Donovan Peoples-Jones was having a pretty good hot streak towards the end of the season. He was developing a lot of chemistry with Deshaun Watson. He even had a game where he had a punt return for a touchdown, which, depending on your league scorings, that could count or not. But there was a game where in Cleveland, it was like negative 10 degrees with like 20 mile per hour wind chills. I'm like, yeah, I'm not starting Donovan Peoples-Jones in this game. And I started Isaiah Hodgins. And that was the week Isaiah Hodgins had, I think, 2 touchdowns in one of those games. So these situations where it sounds so dumb, but check the weather for some of these games.
Yeah.
Do the extra homework. It makes you that much better when you're trying to get every advantage against your league mates. Prepare for buys, prepare for bad weather games. Hey, a very well-known stat is that like 13 of the 17 Lions games this year are in domes or something like that, right? Do you know that? Do you have Jared Goff? What weeks is he not playing in a dome? Do that extra tidbit of homework, Bob, to make that difference between you and your league mates. Because me not starting Donovan Peoples-Jones last year got me to the championship game because I started Isaiah Hodgins instead. And we all know how I feel about Isaiah Hodgins now. But again, the point is, be that extra bit of preparedness over your league mates. It will make a difference.
Absolutely, Zach. You should be doing all the homework you can to possibly stay ahead. Doing the more research, knowing more just in general about your player situations is going to keep you a step ahead of your league mates. Something else that will as well is not ruling out making additions to your teams that just aren't sexy. Every year, there's players that just come out of the woodwork that nobody had written on paper. Nobody was expecting Rex Burkhead 2 years ago
Isaiah
to be
Hodgins.
out there. Isaiah Hodgins, sure, Zach has to get your mention in there last year. And Justin Jackson 2 years ago, we talked about it last year, that Justin Jackson won people leagues 2 years ago. There's going to be players that come out, off your waiver, off Fab, players that you can trade for off people's scrap heap of a bottom of their roster that might not even be looking to compete this year, but just have players that are looking to move. Don't rule out adding these players. All it is a matter of, well, he's not very good. Why should I get him? He's scoring points. That's what matters. Even if it's for a handful of weeks, he's filling in for Dalvin Cook being hurt. He's filling in for, like last year was Donovan Knight, filling in for Breece Hall after the injury. Had a very few good or a handful of good weeks where he was a major player for you. Now he's nothing, but he was for a while. He was something for you for a while. Keeping these little things in mind, especially as a competitive team or a rebuilding team that needs to flip players or wants to flip players, not everybody is going to be a long-term solution for you in Dynasty. And I think if people sometimes see that, hey, this player is not going to be very good for me beyond X insert season I'm in currently, they're not worth adding to my roster. But what if instead of that thought you had, well, I could add this player and then I could use them to possibly get myself into the playoffs because week 13 bye week sucked this year. Need somebody for week 13, need somebody to fill my lineup slot for that week. Now I'm in the playoffs. Now I win a championship because once you're in the dance, it's pants off, dance off. Anybody can take it home. Or you're a rebuilding team. You go spend 6 fab going and picking up whoever it is this year that ends up coming out of the woodwork as a player who ends up being very viable for fantasy teams. And again, we can't assume that all leagues are super deep rosters where there's nobody out on the waivers. There's plenty of shallower dynasty leagues where there's going to be viable players out there. Not every league is like ours, Zach, where I have the rosters cranked up to like 40 players and 10 taxi squad slots. But pick these players up now. And now you trade that player for a 3rd round pick who may be on your roster for 5, 6, 7 years. You never know. Or use that to get a pick where you trade up, you pair it with your 2nd round pick to get into the later first. Something along those lines. You can't think of these things as such small moves just because in essence that's what they are. But at the end of the day, they have long-reaching consequences just because you went and picked up Rex Burkhead for the fun of it. Whether if it was for the trade, use him as trade bait, whether it was to set him in your lineup for a couple weeks because he was putting up points, whatever the case is, rip Rex Burkhead at this point. You got to keep these moves in mind. Not every trade target or productive player is going to end up on everybody's sexy trade targets list of the week 7. You got to look for players who are also just being in general productive. Got to keep these guys in mind, Zach. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to dive into your next point if you don't have anything else to add. But absolutely, I feel like you gotta keep everybody in mind. You can't rule out players for the sake of ruling them out for what they can do for your team. But go ahead, dive into any thoughts you have.
Listen, this is why we do Dynasty, man. The whole point of Dynasty is like the extra work that is different from redraft,
Sure.
the bigger rosters, the expanded interest in the league. And a lot of that has to do with like, hey, there are the bottom two spots and your taxi squad, if your league is big enough, should be used to turn players over. This is going to kind of go into my next point, Bob, and I'll tie it with a bow in just a second. It's staying up to date on player usage. What do I mean by that? Being able to identify players in your league, Bob, who have budding opportunities with their teams or diminishing opportunities with their teams that can help you to identify players to buy or players to sell before the rest of the market catches on. And sometimes it's not even buy or sell. It's like, hey, I like this player. I like what they've done. Let me capitalize on that. I'm going to give you a great example. Demario Douglas. Right now, Demario Douglas, a 6th-round pick. Nobody talked about this guy. Wide receiver from Liberty, Patriots. Wide receivers, they're terrible at it. Who cares? They got Kayshon Boutte in the 6th round as well. Demario Douglas did not play in the last preseason game. Played 2 snaps the preseason game before, 2 catches. They took him out of the game. This dude's making the roster, and potentially by the end of the season is the Patriots wide receiver 3, depending on what happens with Devontae Parker, Kendrick Bourne, so on and so forth. He's been their shining training camp story. If you were paying attention to player usage in training camp, this is obviously something that we want you to do during the season as well. But if you're paying attention to that, you picked up on a player that now you might have gotten a wide receiver 3 or 4 for free. So was this a situation where you could have capitalized on that? Now, how can we translate that into the regular season? Let's look at certain situations. The Bears backfield. If week 1, Bob, Khalil Herbert has 80% of the carries, it's time to sell. Yep. It's time to sell. It is time to sell right now if you can. But it is even more of a time to sell if week 1, Khalil Herbert has 80% of the touches. Because Roschon Johnson's coming. I love Khalil Herbert, but I'm not dumb. I'm not stupid and emotional with these types of situations. Pay attention to player usage. Whose value is increasing, whose value is decreasing because of these situations, and can you buy or sell, or do you want to keep that player because of a situation that may benefit you a year or 2 down the line here, Bob?
Being mindful of, whether they're playing well or even if they're, trending the wrong way, something to keep in mind, because it absolutely plays a role in, if you can kind of sense that, this maybe ain't looking so hot for this guy anymore. Maybe we need to readjust our mindset. Maybe this, second string running back is turning into the first string running back, whatever the case is. Maybe it kind of gives you an idea that maybe it's time to jump ship before people, wise up, because we know that not everybody's as plugged in, checking their lineups every day as the next guy. Some people don't see this stuff. They don't get a chance to, and that's okay. It is what it is. But this also leads me to my next point. Understand and be mindful of the shifts in player value that happens throughout the season. What is the value shift in whatever player is trending up or down, and what can you do with it? Learn to make the values work for you, as opposed to just, well, this player costs more now. Now if I want to buy them, I have to go buy them, or if I sell them, I just keep them. Have some more foresight. Getting into my notes a little bit and less off base. We always say, don't hate players, hate values. Throughout the season, values will fluctuate dramatically. One good game can launch a player's value into the stratosphere. We know how Dynasty works. We know how the community can react to good or bad games. Bad games can lead to, or an injury can lead to values plummeting. Either which way, how can you use these things to your advantage? That's what you want to do at the end of the day, especially if you don't agree with the trajectory things are going. If, say, Christian Watson, for example, last year, I was very adamant and still am wary that I think in some circles he's greatly overvalued, because what he did was a lot of touchdown production in not a lot of time on very little volume. That's not usually a recipe for success. At the end of the day, usually you need a little more volume, and then the touchdown luck happens over time, not just all in one sitting. So that would be a case where if you have something like that happening, I'm looking to sell that player at the new exponential value. If I have it, I'm not touching that player when it comes to buying. Ultimately, can you use this hype wave a player is riding to trade him for a similarly producing player plus an additional asset? And this now obviously only works if you have the player in question. But like we touched on before, can you use a player's slumps to buy low or more reasonably priced for a player who wasn't as accessible previously? That's what you want to do, keeping values in mind and being, in tune with how values are shifting. Whenever positive things happen, the value is going to go up, especially if they keep trending that same direction. But again, have to take into consideration what's going on external from that player. Is this quarterback just on an ungodly hot streak? Is this offense playing really bad defenses? Is, this player just having plays where, the wide receiver fell down and now it's a 70-yard touchdown? Is it big splash plays like that just don't happen a lot? Or is it very consistent usage and volume and people are trying to write it off as a farce or a fake breakout? Hell, last year, great example was Amon-Ra St. Brown, of people who were just pounding us in the comments for thinking that Amon-Ra St. Brown is still going to be as good as he was at the tail end of his rookie season. Guess what? Here we are. Amon-Ra St. Brown's a consensus top 10 dynasty wide receiver. I don't know who called that, but good on us, I guess. But either which way, be mindful of these value shifts. And most importantly, what you can do with them, especially if you don't believe in them or you believe in the counterpoint of them. Zach, feel free to touch on this or dive into your last point.
Yeah, that's a very dynamic point, the value
Yes.
shifts, because for me, I always have a built-in value, and I don't go with the ebbs and flows of the regular season. Like I
agree.
feel the same way about Christian Watson I felt about him in the rookie draft last year, because of exactly what you said. He was electric when he was on the field, but he wasn't on the field long enough. He's one of these players, if he gets a hamstring injury, that's the biggest part of his game, is his speed. Yeah. He obviously has the size, but his speed is just, it's electric. But then just there was just minimal volume in his production last year. It was 42, 43 receptions, I think it was, but 7 or 8 touchdowns. Yeah. So I'm not swayed by that ebb and flow of what I saw. Like, I need to see a larger sample size. And then we can equate that to Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? We did see in the Amon-Ra St. Brown's rookie season a 5 or 6 week stretch where it was like, holy moly. But you can take that a little bit further, right? He wasn't injured his rookie year. He just didn't have opportunity because he was a 4th round pick. When he did get the opportunity, he burst on the scene. And you look at that situation moving forward, it's like, yeah, they added Jameson Williams in the offseason of after Amon's breakout, but they complement each other very well. Amon's not the field stretcher that Jameson is, and Jameson isn't the 5-10 yard guy that Amon is. A lot of these situations involve nuance, and they're a very dynamic situation, as you mentioned. So I think it's a great point. That one is where it's great to have a community of people to have a discussion with, because these situations are all different. And hey guys, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? And a lot of times I'll throw a situation to the Discord and ask you guys, and because while we are the experts, there's still a lot of things I'm like, I don't know, man. I need somebody else to convince me on this, So that's where it's great to have like the patron Discord that we have. So if you're not in there, please jump on in there and get in there with us. My last point here, Bob, huge one for me. And you know that I am a living, breathing example of this, is understand your league mates' philosophies. How do you do that? You got to get in people's faces, man. You got to be part of the chat. You got to react to trades, whether you agree or disagree. You got to do it in a respectful way. You got to understand your league mates' philosophies. You got to talk to them. You got to be in their DMs and just having discussions with them. I have some great fantasy football friends I've never met, because I'm just, hey, what's going on? Whatever. Are your league mates, are some of them all in terms of winning at the expense of their future? Do some owners never move their 1st round pick? Know who's who and how they operate. And that'll save you a lot of time. Like, oh, I know not to offer this guy this trade. It's not worth my time. Or, hey, this guy, Cooper Kupp, just got an injury. I got Mike Evans. I don't need him. Let's see if he might want him. Know who's who, how they operate, and if it works for you, how can you take advantage of that situation Not taking advantage of that person, but taking advantage of that situation. Say, hey, I have a piece that is getting older for me. And like you said, Bob, make sure you know the value changes, so on and so forth. They can serve you better than they can serve me. You don't care about your draft picks. Let's go, pal. So know your league mates, understand them. A great way you can do that is keep track of your league's startup draft. Who's moving future picks? Who's going all in for the win right now? Who doesn't care about their draft? Who sold off all their draft picks in the rookie draft? You know why? Because I bet you next offseason, they'll do the same thing with their rookie picks. They will move their rookie picks next offseason because they did the same thing in the startup draft. They don't care about rookie picks. You got to be the first one there, Bob. You have to be the first one there to get that guy's first round pick. Because once it's gone, that person who's got it is probably not moving it. Yeah.
Yeah. Once you make a trade to get an asset, some people hold on to that like life and death. Like, especially if they struggle to get it. Like, man, I spent 10 weeks of trading with this punk, and I finally got the pick. Now I'm not giving it away to the likes of you, but 100% be that first one there, knowing how your league mates operate. And this is why, like you say, be in tune with your league and your league mates and talk to these people, because if you can get in their head and know how they operate, then you kind of know the chess moves to make, because you know what they're going to do, or generally what they're going to try to strategize or build around, whether it's drafting or their team build. If they, like you said, they just trash all their picks the second they get them, absolutely be the first guy there to get in on the action 100%. But the last thing, and this kind of even touches back to the last point, is keep the future in mind, but don't let it rule you in the present, and vice versa. We're playing the long game, but we want to win at some point too. For that to happen at some point, you're likely going to invest in players that won't help you for a long time. They're here for a good time, not necessarily a long time. And you'll have to spend draft capital or younger players with longer projected windows of production to do so. On that same note, while we want to win at some point, we can't leave the cupboard bare. We have to, continue to have picks to work around draft boards later in future drafts if we expect our dynasty to continue to last after a championship push. And remember, if we win, it might feel worth it. But if we don't, it definitely won't feel worth it if we go all in and don't make the, final push. We've talked about this, a lot of times, Zach, is that too often it's too much about the future and nobody ends up turning the corner. At some point, you got to turn on your redraft brain and be like, what players is it going to take for me to win this year? Especially if you have decent enough draft capital built up for the future. Instead of just trading in this year's rookie that just hasn't developed yet and been a wide receiver one in their rookie season, instead of just trading that wide receiver for next year's wide receiver, what are you going to do instead? How are you going to break out of that mindset of just trying to have, as I mentioned before, the sexiest, youngest paper roster? Because at the end of the day, it isn't the young players who win championships. It's the players who are doing well in redraft leagues. And that's not necessarily 30-year-old players all the time, but it's players who are 25, 26, 27, 28, in that prime of players' careers that are winning leagues. At the end of the day, like I said, we want to keep the future in mind. I don't want to win a champ. I obviously want to win a championship by somewhat of all means, but I don't want to win a championship at the expense of the rest of my dynasty. I don't want to win a championship and then have to rebuild for 3 years. I get that I have a pot to play with now, but I don't want to spend the next 3 years rebuilding. As much as I love rebuilding, I want to win for a few years. That's how I want to get there. I just think too often I see teams that just have all this draft capital, and then, as we talked about in a previous roster review, we just draft players with it instead of trading for proven vets or using it to improve the players we already have. Whatever the case is, Zach, I know you're passionate on this point too. I want to hear your thoughts on this final point before we get out of here. What do you got?
We've definitely talked about this one before. We don't want to harp on it too much. I love rookie picks, but one of the points we talked about earlier is know your strategy. At some point, the rebuild's got to end, and we got to go for it. It may not be the sexy. I may be starting David Montgomery and Mike Evans. Like, it's not sexy. They're not young players, but they're productive players. And the point is to win. Now, did I trade for those guys at the expense of my future first? Don't do that. But at
Right.
some point we got to go in. We got to make some moves. Rookies are great, but if I got Joe Burrow and Jalen Hurts in the Superflex league, start 10. I like there's one league, Bob, where I have that situation. I think I have Joe Burrow and Josh Allen as my quarterbacks, and I almost look at it as a money ball approach. These two quarterbacks are going to score 900 points. Last year, the playoffs, the last place playoff team scored 1,900 points. How can I fill out the rest of this roster to get me 1,000 points? How can I do that? Sometimes we got to go in and try and win these things, especially when I have these players who, a couple of years, Joe Burrow could turn into Russell Wilson. We don't know. We don't know how these things are going to turn out. So love this point. I definitely love rookie picks. Don't get me wrong. But when I see a roster review and I see that it's got all these rookie picks, like, how does that get you excited for a dynasty season? How does that get you? Like, do you not? And I say this: trade for some players you like. Who do you want to watch? Like, trade for Michael Wilson, trade for Kendra Miller, trade for a player that you want to watch and see. Like, hey, man, I want to be right on. Bob, I love being right on my guys. You know that. Hey, let's go.
I know.
So, like, at least have that on your roster as something to get you through the season. These teams that have like all rookie draft picks, I get it, but I don't get it. Especially like don't use those all to draft. So we've talked about that ad nauseum. If that's something you want a little bit more information on, make sure to hit us up in the Discord. We've done roster reviews where it's like, I know what you traded to get these picks. Come on, man. You had 3, now you got 5. Like, oh, okay, man. Like 3's enough for me.
No, I hear 100%. Keeping the long-term in mind at the detriment of the present when you could be making competitive pushes. It's fun always looking ahead and always building a future, but at some point you got to cross that bridge. And if you want to cross that bridge to be competitive this season, if you want to be dominant in your dynasty league, even if you're not winning your league, if you want to win from a strategical aspect, looking towards the future, if you are in a rebuild and you're looking to continue rebuilding through next year, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video. Hit us up, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Have a ton of bonus content. Zach has a bonus podcast every single week. If you want to hear that, you'll have to go there to do it. Get in that $5 tier. If you want to get access to a bunch of additional rankings, our $10 tier, our gold tier will get you there. And then if you want your roster reviewed, payhip.com/Dynasty Rewind. You can get all the goods there. All of those links in the description box below, and plenty of other ways to support this channel, support this brand, support this team, support us. That's going to be it for this one. I do hope it was helpful. If it was, if you enjoyed, please leave a like. We'll see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one and you dominate your regular season in 2023.